You've seen that kid before, sitting at the edge of the playground, where the noise fades into a distant hum. He isn't lonely, he isn't broken, he's watching. The swing chains creak, the air vibrates with laughter and arguments. And somewhere behind those calm eyes, a whole world is unfolding. Quietness, in a world that equates noise with value, looks suspicious. Adults whisper, "He's so shy." Teachers write needs to participate more in red ink. But what no one sees is that silence for some isn't the absence of thought, it's the depth of it. Inside that quiet is an entire constellation of imagination, curiosity, and observation. While others speak to fill space, he listens to understand it. His mind catches details most people miss. The flicker in someone's smile, the uneven rhythm of laughter, the stories that float between words. He isn't disconnected, he's tuned to a different frequency. Quiet children are often mistaken for being withdrawn or disinterested, but stillness isn't passivity, it's perception. The world tells them to speak up, but sometimes what the quiet kid is doing is far more profound. Absorbing. They're building an interior language of meaning before they ever put it into words. Silence for them is not a void. It's a workspace where observation becomes empathy, where imagination becomes clarity. The quiet child isn't behind. They're ahead in a different direction, mapping the unseen patterns of human behavior while the rest of the world rushes past. And this is where most people misunderstand them. They confuse still water for shallow depth, but in truth that quiet surface hides an ocean of thought. When you see that kid sitting alone, don't assume absence. Assume presence, a deeper kind of presence that doesn't need to announce itself. Because while the world measures worth by volume, the quiet kid is learning something rarer: how to understand before they respond. And one day, when they finally do speak, you'll realize they weren't silent all along. They were preparing to say something that actually matters. Silence doesn't always grow from the same soil. Sometimes it's temperament, a nervous system built for stillness. Some children simply arrive in the world preferring soft lights, slow movements, and long pauses. The noise that energizes others overwhelms them. The chaos of the classroom, the constant talking, the competition for attention. It all feels like standing too close to a speaker that never stops buzzing. So they retreat, not out of fear, but out of balance. Stillness is their way of returning to themselves. But for others, quiet isn't natural. It's learned. It's what happens when every attempt to speak was met with interruption, criticism, or indifference. Imagine being a child who finally builds the courage to say something, and watching an adult sigh, dismiss, or talk over you. Eventually, you stop trying. You learn that silence keeps the peace, that withholding your thoughts is safer than watching them get crushed. In some homes, quiet becomes survival. The dinner table isn't a place for stories. It's a minefield where emotion is too much, where a raised voice means danger, and the only way to feel safe is to disappear into your own head. You learn to soothe yourself by vanishing, by staying small, by staying quiet. Then comes school, the stage where performance is mistaken for intelligence. Classrooms reward the fastest hand raised, the loudest opinion, the student who can fill the silence first. The quiet ones are treated like they're defective, as though reflection were a flaw. They get labelled shy, unengaged, or lacking confidence, when in reality, they're simply processing, deeply, slowly, and completely. And that's where the misunderstanding begins. The world sees hesitation. The quiet child feels exhaustion. Because trying to keep up with a world that never pauses feels like sprinting with your lungs full of water. Some of these children will adapt. They'll learn to wear extroversion like armor, to perform noise just to belong. Others will retreat even further, deciding that the world will never slow down enough to meet them. Either way, the silence grows, not just as a habit, but as an identity. So when you see a quiet child, don't assume they're broken or scared. Some were born into stillness, others were pushed into it. But both deserve understanding, not repair. Because behind that silence is either a soul finding peace, or one still searching for permission to exist without raising its voice. There's something uncanny about the quiet kid, not eerie but perceptive, like they're tuned to a wavelength the rest of the room can't hear. While everyone else rushes to speak, to be seen, to prove they belong, the quiet child is watching. Not idly, attentively, like an artist studying light before touching the canvas. You can see it in their eyes. They don't dart around, they linger. They watch the rhythm of people, the way one classmate's smile doesn't reach their eyes, the way the teacher's tone softens for some and hardens for others. They notice things too small to name, the sigh before an argument, the stillness before someone cries. It's not that they don't want to be part of the noise, it's that they're fascinated by it. They're studying how people move, how emotions ripple through a room, how laughter can hide insecurity. They're decoding humanity one gesture at a time. That's the paradox of the quiet child. They're often intensely social in their own way, just not in the way the world measures it. They crave connection, but not performance. They want to understand others, not outshine them. While others compete to be heard, the quiet child listens to what isn't said. Every day, they're collecting data, fragments of behaviour, tone, silence, and contradiction. To them, listening isn't passive. It's active work. It's how they survive, and how they make sense of a world that rarely pauses long enough to explain itself. And those fragments they gather, the overlooked details, become raw material. They stack in their minds like stones, unremarkable on their own, but precious when arranged with care. Over time, those stones build worlds. They turn into metaphors, inventions, stories, and art. Because when you spend your childhood watching instead of performing, you start seeing patterns. You start understanding motives. You learn empathy, not from lectures, but from observing pain in real time. You learn design not from textbooks, but from noticing how systems fail. You learn emotion not from words, but from silence. Many of the world's most creative minds began exactly this way, as quiet observers. Poets, scientists, engineers, filmmakers, therapists, people who built their genius on watching before acting. Their silence wasn't shyness, it was calibration. It was gathering the world piece by piece until they could finally rearrange it in their own language. But here's what makes it bittersweet. While they're developing this rich inner intelligence, the outside world rarely sees it. Teachers think they're disengaged. Parents think they're aloof. Friends think they're indifferent. No one realizes that behind that silence, there's a storm of awareness, a consciousness so alive it needs quiet just to keep from overflowing. And that's the paradox. The quiet child sees everything, but is rarely seen. They understand others more deeply than others ever understand them. They speak rarely, but when they do, their words cut through noise like light through fog. Because they've spent years watching how people use word and learning when silence says more. So the next time you see a quiet kid sitting alone, know this: they're not retreating, they're recording. They're composing the world into something they'll one day give back, not louder but truer. And when that moment comes, when the observer finally decides to speak, what they say won't just fill space, it will shift it. Silence is delicate. It's not weakness, but it doesn't stand much of a chance in a world that worships noise. From the moment a child enters society, the classroom, the playground, the endless stream of small talk, the message is clear. Be seen, be heard, be loud, or be forgotten. For the quiet child, that message lands like a demand to become someone they're not. The world doesn't reward thoughtfulness, it rewards immediacy. It praises quick answers, not deep ones. It calls constant talking confidence and constant reflection hesitation. And so the quiet child begins to believe that something about their nature needs fixing. They internalize a dangerous rule. You must be louder to be loved. It starts subtly. They notice how teachers smile wider at the kids who raise their hands first, how classmates form circles around the most talkative voices, how adults interpret quiet as a problem that needs solving. And so they adapt. They start performing extroversion, smiling bigger, talking faster, pretending to enjoy chaos. It's a mask and it works, at least for a while. But masking has a cost. It's like holding your breath in social air that wasn't made for you. Every joke delivered, every conversation forced, drains a little more from the inside. You go home exhausted, not from interaction itself, but from the effort of pretending it feels natural. You replay the day, wondering why connection always feels like a performance. Others retreat instead. They stop trying to keep up with the speed of the room. They decide that maybe the world just isn't meant for people like them, that quietness is better than pretending. They find refuge in solitude, but even solitude starts to feel like exile. What began as self-protection turns into isolation. That's the cruel irony. The very silence that once kept them safe now becomes the thing that makes them invisible. The world they're observing doesn't slow down to meet them. It rushes past, too impatient to notice what it's losing. And so, a quiet child grows into an adult carrying a private exhaustion, one that sleep doesn't cure. They move through social spaces like an actor between scenes, switching roles, waiting for a moment that feels real. But reality rarely makes room for the quiet. Because ours is a culture that mistakes volume for value. It celebrates the one who speaks first, not the one who thinks hardest. It promotes the voice that dominates, not the one that listens. And so silence becomes fragile, a thin thread constantly pulled by the hands of expectation. But inside that fragility lies resilience. The quiet survive by adapting, by watching, by learning how to exist in a world that misunderstands them. They may bend, but they rarely break. Because somewhere deep inside, they remember what authenticity feels like. The calm that exists before the noise begins. And maybe that's what the world forgets most. Quiet isn't emptiness, it's integrity. It's refusing to shout just because everyone else is shouting. One day, the quiet child might take off the mask completely. Not to fit in, but to belong, finally, on their own terms. And when they do, the silence that once made them invisible will turn into something else entirely: strength. Because in a world addicted to volume, staying true to your quiet is the loudest act of rebellion there is. Adults love a quiet child. They call them so well behaved, easy, no trouble at all. They brag about how calm they are, how they never make a fuss. But beneath that praise hides a cruel misunderstanding. Easy is not the same as okay. The quiet child becomes the one teachers don't worry about, the one parents don't check on as much because they seem fine. But fine is often code for unseen. Because when attention is given out by volume, to the loudest, the neediest, the ones who demand it, the quiet ones fade into the background. Their silence becomes their camouflage, and the world rewards it. Adults relax around them thinking, finally, a child who doesn't talk back, one who doesn't need constant attention. But that relief is dangerous, because it teaches the quiet child something poisonous. Your needs are optional. Over time, they learn not to raise their hand when confused, not to voice discomfort, not to ask for help. They wait, patiently, endlessly, for someone to notice without them having to say it. But no one does. Those long waits accumulate. They become emotional calluses, small, invisible marks that harden the heart over time. When a child's needs go consistently unheard, they stop believing their needs matter. And that's when silence shifts from temperament to identity. They stop just being quiet and start becoming erased. By adolescence, the lesson is ingrained. They apologize before speaking, shrink in group settings, and hesitate before taking up space. They think, I don't want to bother anyone. That phrase becomes a reflex, a script, and every time they say it, they reinforce the belief that their presence is a burden. In adulthood, this pattern hides beneath words like independent, low maintenance, self-sufficient. But those are often euphemisms for "I learned not to ask for much because no one ever came when I did." The tragedy is that quiet kids rarely act out, so no one realizes they're struggling. You can't punish what you don't see, but you also can't nurture what doesn't make noise. And while others are taught that their voice has power, the quiet child learns the opposite, that silence keeps them safe, even when it slowly starves them. But here's the quiet truth. The child who doesn't demand attention may be the one who needs it most. They don't need to be fixed or drawn out. They need to be seen. To have someone sit beside them and ask not, "Why don't you talk more?" but "What are you thinking about?" Because silence, when ignored, becomes isolation. But silence, when honoured, becomes trust. The difference between those two outcomes isn't in the child, it's in the adults who decide whether to listen. So the next time you see the quiet kid, the one who never interrupts, never asks, never cries for help, remember, their calmness might not be peace. It might be resignation. And what they need isn't noise, it's permission. Permission to exist loudly, gently, and fully, without feeling like they're asking for too much. There's a certain kind of power in being quiet. The quiet kid doesn't need to fill the air with words to capture attention. When they finally do speak, their words are like precious coins, rare, deliberate, measured. They don't waste their voice on trivialities, which makes it all the more valuable when they do decide to say something. And when they do, people tend to listen. But here's the catch. Being heard and being understood are two very different things. Quiet children, when they finally speak, often find that their words don't land the way they intend. In a world that thrives on immediacy, their slow, considered thoughts can seem out of sync with the group's fast-paced energy. They offer insights that feel like whispers in a room full of shouts, and often those whispers go unnoticed or misunderstood. When everyone around them is reacting in real time, the quiet child's response is different. It's thoughtful, it's measured, it requires time to process and articulate, which feels like an inconvenience in a world that prizes quick retorts and witty comebacks. So their thoughts, which are often more complex, more nuanced, go unheard, not because they lack substance, but because they don't fit the rhythm of the conversation. This is the real heartache of being quiet. You can be heard but still missed. You can share a piece of your soul, carefully crafted, and watch as it slips through the cracks of social dynamics, unnoticed or unappreciated. You speak and your words are acknowledged, but the deeper meaning, the weight, the texture, the intent, gets lost in translation. For the quiet child, this dynamic becomes exhausting. They start to shrink their thoughts, compressing them into smaller packages, trying to fit them into the space everyone else occupies. They start to second-guess themselves, trimming their ideas to match the tempo of the conversation, until they're no longer offering original thoughts. They're offering responses that fit the mold. Their voice, once rich with complexity, becomes a mere echo of what they could have said. And so they learn to stay quieter. They stop speaking when they realize that the more they try to fit in, the further they move away from their truth. They become fluent in the language of apology, saying, "Sorry, I didn't mean to take up so much space," before they've even started talking, before their words have even been given a chance to breathe. But here's the paradox. The quiet child's silence is not passive. It is patient. It is not an absence, but an accumulation, a storehouse of reflections and impressions, a deep well of ideas that are waiting to be expressed. And when that silence finally does break, it has the potential to reshape the room, to change the dynamics, to shift the energy, but only if the world is ready to listen. In many ways, the quiet child is a reminder that listening requires more than just hearing. It requires patience, it requires presence, and most importantly, it requires the willingness to give space to what is not immediately obvious. What would happen if we lived in a world that didn't rush to fill silence, but let it breathe. What would happen if we valued the quiet responder as much as the quick one? Imagine if we gave the quiet child, the one who listens instead of talks, the one who absorbs instead of reacts, the time and the space to share their thoughts without shrinking them to fit into the group's tempo. Imagine if instead of forcing them to conform to the pace of everyone else, we slowed down to meet them. Because here's the thing, true understanding isn't about speed, it's about depth. And the quiet child, in their deliberate, reflective way, holds more depth than many will ever realize. They may not shout to be heard, but when they do speak, they speak with purpose. And that purpose is something we need to hear. Silence is a strange thing. It's not just the absence of noise, but the presence of something else entirely. For the quiet child, silence can feel like both a refuge and a cage, a sanctuary and a prison. It's a space where they can think, breathe, process, a place where they can become who they truly are, free from the demands of the outside world. But it's also a space that can isolate them, close them off, make them feel invisible, and force them to shrink even further into themselves. In some ways, silence is their chapel. In that quiet space, they reflect, they grow, they build worlds within worlds. They are not silent because they have nothing to say. They are silent because they are waiting. Waiting to see, waiting to understand, waiting for a moment when they can speak in a way that matters. The silence allows them to accumulate nuance. It allows them to observe and absorb the world, not as it is, but as it could be. They are learning the language of depth, of careful thought, of considered responses. And in that silence, they find a quiet peace, a connection to their own mind and spirit that the noise of the world can never touch. But this silence, if not understood, can also become a prison. It's not just the absence of sound, it's the absence of connection. When no one listens to the quiet child, when no one reaches out to them, when their needs are overlooked simply because they don't ask for attention, that silence begins to turn inward. It starts to feel like an absence of worth, as if their voice is unnecessary, their presence optional. The quiet child begins to internalize the belief that silence equals value. They start to see themselves as easy, low maintenance, uncomplicated, when really they are just invisible. And that invisibility cuts deep, because while they are busy navigating their inner world, the world around them is moving on without them. Their absence is not one of choice, it's one of neglect. They stop asking, stop speaking, stop believing that their voice matters at all. Silence, once a place of peace and reflection, becomes a prison where they lock away parts of themselves. They stop speaking their truth, stop asking for what they need, stop even thinking they deserve to be seen. Instead, they apologize for their presence, apologize for their quietness, apologize for being. Every word they speak feels like an imposition. Every request for attention feels like a demand they shouldn't be making. They become fluent in apology, learning to shrink their words before they even leave their lips. But here's the painful beauty of it. Silence doesn't have to be a prison. It doesn't have to be self-erasure. Silence, when met with understanding, can be a sanctuary. The quiet child doesn't need to be fixed. They don't need to be made louder. What they need is for their silence to be respected, their presence to be seen, and their voice to be heard. It's not about erasing the silence, but about learning to understand its language. The quiet child speaks in pauses, in subtlety, in depth, a language that requires patience, not impatience, awareness, not haste. When we slow down to listen to the quiet child, we don't just hear their words, we hear their thoughts, we hear their world. So the question becomes, how can we turn silence into a gift rather than a burden? How can we allow the quiet child to hold space for themselves without being told to speak up, to speak more, to be louder? The answer is simple. We need to stop seeing silence as a problem to fix and start seeing it as a quality to nurture. Because silence at its best is not absence, it's presence. It's the ability to pause, to consider, to listen. And when we give space to that silence, when we honor it for what it is, we open the door for the quiet child to speak, not just to be heard, but to be understood. Adolescence is a brutal time for the quiet child. It's the stage where the world demands you to be someone you're not. It's a time when your value isn't determined by your thoughts or your integrity. It's determined by your visibility. And that visibility in the world of social media, peer groups, and instant validation is often equated with noise. With visibility comes loudness. With loudness comes acceptance. And in the midst of it all, the quiet child, who once found refuge in their interior world, begins to question their very existence. Because suddenly, their silence feels like a defect. In a culture where identity is carved out in likes, followers, and profile pictures, the quiet child's introspection feels increasingly irrelevant. They may begin to wonder, do I matter if no one is watching me? The very thing that once gave them peace, that equal where their rich inner life, their ability to think deeply without distraction, now feels like a liability. It's a space that is increasingly out of step with their peers, who form identities in real time, broadcasted through tweets and stories, likes and shares. The quiet child, once comfortable in their solitude, now finds themselves staring at the noise around them, a noise that's not just external, but internal. The comparison grows louder. Why doesn't anyone notice me? Why does it seem like everyone else is moving forward while I stay behind? And perhaps the most painful thought of all, maybe my silence means I'm not worthy of being seen. This is when the quiet child can begin to lose themselves. They start trying to fit into the boxes they see others occupying. They attempt to perform extroversion, mimicking the loud, the visible, the ones who seem to have it all figured out. But it doesn't feel right. It never does. The more they force themselves into a mold that isn't theirs, the more they lose the essence of who they truly are. Masking becomes a survival strategy, but it's a hollow one. Every moment they pretend to be someone they're not drains their energy, pushing them further into isolation. But here's the twist a bit. This isn't just about adolescence. It's a pattern that can follow the quiet child well into adulthood. The quiet child grows into an adult who's learned to make themselves invisible, not because they lack capability, but because they were never taught to take up space. They might choose careers behind the scenes, taking on supporting roles or secondary responsibilities, not because they lack ambition, but because they were never given permission to be seen. Their potential isn't the problem. Their ability to assert it is. They shrink, not out of fear of failure, but out of fear of occupying too much space in a world that's always told them they don't need to be loud to exist. They work in the background, behind closed doors, quietly achieving and quietly disappearing. They do it because they learned early on that their value was something to be earned, and so they earn it by staying small. And yet, there's an alternative path that some quiet children take, one that reclaims the power of silence. In the silence, they find clarity. In the quiet, they find their own voice. And while society rewards the visible, the quiet child's depth, thoughtfulness, and patience can be the perfect antidote to the fast-paced, loud world they've always been forced to live in. The key to understanding the quiet child, especially as they grow into adulthood, is recognizing that silence isn't weakness, it's strength. And while the world rushes to be seen, the quiet person holds the space to see what others cannot. They may not shout to be heard, but they are often the ones who notice the things that others miss. This is the quiet revolution waiting to happen. What if we valued depth over spectacle? What if we stopped measuring people's worth by how loud they speak and started appreciating them for how much they listen? The quiet child, and the quiet adult they become, has an incredible power. The power to see, to understand, to create, and to lead in ways that the world often fails to recognize. They don't need to take the spotlight. They need the space to share their wisdom in their own time, in their own way. And when the world finally listens to their quiet, when it begins to appreciate the depth beneath the surface, they'll realize how much they've missed by only celebrating noise. Invisibility is a strange thing. It's a shadow that follows you, always present but never acknowledged. The quiet child, as they grow, often finds themselves caught in this paradox. They are there, present, but not seen. They are contributing, doing, but not celebrated. Their ideas, when they are finally shared, are often ignored until someone else, louder, bolder, repeats the same thought. And when that happens, it's brilliant. The quiet child learns, early on, that their voice is only valuable when someone else amplifies it. But here's the reality. Invisibility isn't absence. It's a space for reflection, a space for understanding. It's in the shadows that the quiet child learns to see things that others miss. In the background, they can observe patterns, hear things unsaid, and develop insights that don't require the noise of the world. They watch people, they study situations, and they build an awareness of life that's both profound and subtle. Yet this invisible space can be suffocating. As they grow older, many quiet children, now adults, find themselves caught between two worlds. On the one hand, they thrive in their quiet, their ability to listen, to observe, to create without the pressures of constant visibility. But on the other hand, they feel the sting of being overlooked. They see others rise into leadership roles, speak up in meetings, and take center stage. The quiet child, meanwhile, quietly performs in the background, ensuring everything works but never taking credit. They have the capacity to lead, but the belief that they aren't allowed to take up space keeps them in the shadows. And this is the crossroads. Some quiet children will, over time, accept their invisibility and learn to exploit it. They find a way to move through life unnoticed, working behind the scenes, handling responsibilities that no one else wants. They accept their role as the silent worker, quietly achieving while never seeking recognition. This path isn't necessarily a sign of weakness, but a survival strategy. It's easier to remain in the background than to step forward and risk rejection. But there's another path, one where the quiet child's invisibility becomes a source of power. The quiet child can use their ability to observe and listen, to lead in a way that doesn't demand attention, but commands respect. They become leaders in their own right, but not through loud declarations or attention-grabbing stunts. Instead, their leadership is born from deep understanding, empathy, and a remarkable capacity for seeing the bigger picture. In leadership, the quiet child becomes the one who notices the people who are left out. They make space for the shy person in the room. They give the quiet idea the chance to be heard, and they listen deeply before offering their own perspective. Their power is not in dominating the conversation, but in knowing when to step back and let others be heard. They lead with patience, with humility, and with an understanding that the loudest voice isn't always the one that makes the most impact. This is the quiet child's true potential. The ability to lead from the margins, to influence without being seen, to create change without demanding credit. They don't need to be the loudest voice in the room to have the greatest impact. And yet, this potential is often stifled by the world's obsession with performance, with visibility, with speed. The quiet child, despite all their gifts, is often overlooked in favour of the louder, faster, more visible personalities. They are dismissed as too quiet to lead, when in reality, their leadership is subtle, but infinitely more effective. The quiet child needs to be given the space to assert themselves, not by becoming someone they're not, but by being fully who they are. We need to stop forcing them to shout to be heard and start appreciating the depth that comes from their silence. We need to understand that they are leaders in their own right, that their insight, when finally shared, will change the world. And so the question becomes, how do we create spaces where the quiet can lead? How do we honour their ability to contribute without forcing them to perform? How do we give them the tools to take up space without losing the very essence of what makes them unique? The quiet child can lead, not through loud declarations, but through thoughtful action. They can change the world not by demanding attention, but by commanding it when it matters most. They don't need to shout to make a difference. They just need the world to listen, and that is the quiet revolution we need. There's a quiet revolution waiting to unfold, one that starts with understanding that silence is not a void to be filled, but a space that holds value in itself. We live in a world built for noise, fast responses, quick meetings, constant feedback loops, and the relentless hum of social media. It's a world where speed is equated with intelligence, visibility with worth, and loudness with importance. In this world, the quiet child, who speaks in pauses, whose thoughts take time to form, and whose words come slowly but with purpose, is often overlooked, misunderstood, and left behind. But what if, instead of demanding the quiet to adapt to a world that thrives on speed, we created spaces where silence was not just tolerated, but valued? What if we reimagined our classrooms, our workplaces, and our communities so that quietness was no longer something to fix, but something to nurture? Imagine a classroom where the first 10 seconds after a question is asked are intentionally left blank. Not awkward, but intentional. Where the quiet child, the one who takes a little longer to process, is given time to think, to absorb, to respond. Imagine meetings where the rush to fill silence with chatter is replaced by a pause that gives space for the quiet mind to articulate something original, something thoughtful, something that has been brewing quietly in the background. In this world, silence wouldn't be a problem. It would be an asset. We would stop assuming that the quiet child has nothing to say and start trusting that when they speak, their words are not only rare, but valuable. We would teach the quiet child how to navigate their silence, how to communicate their inner world when needed, how to translate their thoughts into accessible forms, how to ask for time when they need it. This isn't about forcing the quiet to speak more. It's about giving them the tools to be heard when they do. It's about honoring their rhythm and giving them roles that match their contemplative nature. Roles like the recorder of ideas, the curator of projects, the observer who can see the dynamics that others miss. These roles aren't about making the quiet child more social. They're about giving them pathways to contribute meaningfully without changing who they are. And perhaps most importantly, it's about teaching the world, both children and adults, how to listen. Not just to hear words, but to understand the quiet person's pace, to honour the spaces between their words, the moments of silence that hold deeper meaning. We need to teach society that the quiet person is not disengaged, but engaged differently. They see the world with a different clarity, a depth that requires patience to understand. But this transformation can't happen unless we, as a culture, stop equating visibility with value and start equating depth with worth. What if we taught our children that thoughtfulness, consideration, and introspection are as valuable as speed and extroversion? What if we rewarded depth instead of spectacle? What if we, as a society, made space for those who sit quietly in the corners, listening, observing, thinking deeply? What would happen if we built structures, schools, workplaces, even social norms that acknowledged the quiet as a source of strength, not something to be fixed? Because the truth is, the quiet child, when nurtured, doesn't need to fight for attention. They don't need to fill the air with words. They simply need the world to see them as they are. And when that happens, when society stops demanding the quiet to be louder and starts learning to listen to their unique rhythm, that is when real change will begin. Not just for the quiet child, but for all of us. Because in a world that often feels like it's drowning in noise, the quiet child has something the world desperately needs: the ability to listen, the ability to hold space, the ability to see what others miss. And if we can learn to listen too, if we can start to value quietness for what it truly is, then we might just find the answers to the deepest questions, not in the noise, but in the silence.